Hey there, welcome to Shadow Archives. Just a heads up, there are a few ads between the 5 and 15-minute mark, then it's completely ad-free after that. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax or drift off to sleep. I hope you'll give this video a chance because I truly believe you won't find stories quite like these anywhere else. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. When this happened, my life was still very simple. My world was small in the way it usually is when you're a kid or a young teenager. Home felt safe. Routine felt permanent. Bad things happened on the news or to other people, not to us. We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either. We had what we needed, and we had habits that never really changed. One of those habits was church on Fridays. My family and I went every Friday evening. It wasn't even really for us kids. My parents were part of a group that met there, and my siblings and I just tagged along because that's what families do. We didn't complain much. It was just another part of the week, like school or dinner or doing homework. We'd get ready, pile into the car, drive over, sit around for a while, then come home. Same routine every time. That night was no different. We left the house like we always did. Doors locked, windows closed. Nothing felt off. No strange cars, no weird feelings, no sense that anything bad was about to happen. I remember being annoyed about something small, probably having to go at all, or wanting to stay home and do my own thing. Nothing important, nothing memorable. Church ended, and we drove back home. I still remember the moment we pulled into the driveway. There was nothing obviously wrong from the outside. The house looked exactly the same. Lights off, just like we left them. No broken windows, no busted doors. Everything looked normal enough that none of us were prepared for what we were about to walk into. As soon as the door opened, the feeling changed. It's hard to explain, but there's a certain silence that doesn't feel right. Not the calm kind, the empty kind. The kind where something feels missing before you even know what it is. We stepped inside, and within seconds, my mom stopped walking. Her room was trashed. Drawers were pulled completely out. Clothes were thrown everywhere. Jewelry boxes were overturned and dumped onto the floor. Things that were usually carefully put away were scattered like someone had gone through them in a rush, not caring what they broke or knocked over. It looked violent even though no one had been hurt. Then we checked my room. Mine was trashed too, not just messy, but clearly searched. My things were thrown around, my drawers emptied, my stuff flipped over. It felt wrong in a very personal way. Someone had been in my space. Someone I didn't know. Someone who didn't belong there. Someone who touched my things without permission. That's when we started realizing what was missing. My mom's jewelry was gone. Pieces she'd had for years. Some expensive, some sentimental. Things tied to memories, not just money. My iPad was gone. My Wii was gone. Stuff that mattered to me, stuff that felt like part of my life at the time. But the worst realization came a moment later. My dog had been home the entire time. He was small. Not a guard dog. Just a little dog that followed us around the house and slept wherever he felt like. When the thought hit me, my stomach dropped. I ran to find him, heart pounding, already imagining the worst. I didn't know what burglars did when they broke into houses. I didn't know if they hurt pets. I didn't know if they killed them. I just knew he had been alone in the house with strangers. I found him alive. He was fine, shaken maybe, but physically unharmed. He wagged his tail when he saw us, like nothing had happened, like he didn't understand why everyone was suddenly so upset. The relief hit me so hard I almost cried right there. That small, simple fact was the only thing that kept the situation from feeling completely unbearable. Even so, I was terrified. Not screaming, panicking terror. The quieter kind. The kind that settles in your chest and makes everything feel unreal. The kind that makes you replay moments over and over in your head. I kept thinking about the timeline, about how we had been gone maybe an hour or two, about how during that time someone had chosen our house. Someone had walked up to our door, forced their way in, moved through our rooms, taken what they wanted and left, all while my dog was inside. All while our lives were continuing like normal somewhere else. The police came. They asked questions. They looked around. They wrote things down. They dusted for fingerprints. They did what they were supposed to do. But even as a kid, I could tell that nothing was going to come from it. There were no cameras, no witnesses, no clear leads. Just another break-in among many. They never found our stuff. Not my iPad, not my Wii, not my mom's jewelry. It was just gone. Vanished into whatever system stolen things disappear into. Pawn shops, resellers, trash. Someone else's house. We never knew. The next week, my parents installed a security system. That alone changed the feeling of our house. Suddenly, there were sensors, alarms, beeps, codes. We learned how to arm it before leaving, how to disarm it when coming home. The house felt less open, less trusting, more cautious, more aware. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was something we had to defend. For a long time after that, every small sound made me jump. The house creaking at night, the dog moving around, a branch brushing against a window. I checked locks more than once. I hated being alone. I hated the idea that someone could come back. What really messed with my head wasn't the stolen stuff. It was the violation. Someone had been in our bedrooms. Someone had stood where we stood, touched what we touched, looked through our private things. There's something deeply unsettling about that, especially when you're young and your room feels like the one place in the world that belongs only to you. It also shattered a belief I didn't even realize I had. The belief that bad things don't happen to normal families. The belief that if you follow routines and lock doors and live a quiet life, you're safe. The belief that danger announces itself. This didn't announce itself at all. We left the house. We came back. Everything was changed. I remember lying in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how easily it happened, thinking about how someone watched our house, noticed our pattern, and chose that moment, thinking about how if we had come home early, we might have walked in while they were still inside, thinking about how my dog could have been hurt, thinking about how nothing would have stopped them if they wanted to do worse. Nothing happened beyond the break-in. No one was hurt. No one was attacked. In the grand scheme of things, we were lucky. I know that. I've heard far worse stories. I've read far worse things. I'm aware of that now, but at the time, it was one of the most surreal moments of my life. It was the first time I understood that safety isn't guaranteed, that doors and walls are thinner than they feel, that strangers can cross into your life without warning and leave damage behind even if they never touch you. Even now, years later, I still think about that night sometimes. Not with panic, but with a quiet awareness. I lock my doors, I check my windows, I pay attention to routines. I notice when something feels off. That break-in didn't turn my life upside down, but it changed how I see the world. And sometimes, that's all it takes. My cousin was 30 years old. He lived in Louisiana and worked as a linesman. It was dangerous work, the kind everyone knows is risky but still doesn't fully grasp until something goes wrong. He worked long hours, often in brutal heat, climbing poles, handling live lines, doing the kind of job most people never think about until the power goes out. He was proud of his work. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. He kept lights on, hospitals running, homes livable. The day he died started like any other workday. He was on site with his partner, doing routine work. Nothing out of the ordinary, no bad weather, no emergency conditions. Just another job that had been done hundreds of times before. My cousin was on the ground, moving around the other side of the work truck, carrying a metal bucket in his hand. He was in motion, focused on putting equipment away, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. At the same time, his partner was up on the pole. Somehow, a live line was dropped. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't reckless in the way people imagine accidents being. It was a moment, a mistake, a fraction of a second where something went wrong in a job that requires perfection every time. The live line hit the ground, bounced, and touched the metal bucket my cousin was holding. That was all it took. The electricity traveled instantly through the bucket and into him. There was no chance to react, no chance to drop it, no chance to move away. He was electrocuted immediately. Just like that, he was gone, 30 years old. One moment alive, working, thinking about the rest of his day. The next, dead. The shock of it tore through our family. It's hard to explain what sudden death like that does. There's no warning, no time to prepare emotionally. One phone call changes everything. One sentence that doesn't feel real. You expect mistakes. You expect someone to say they got it wrong. You expect him to walk through the door later, laugh about how close it was, complain about work like always. That never happens. The grief was heavy, but it was also strange. There was no illness to process, no decline to mourn, just absence, just the knowledge that a perfectly healthy, capable person was gone because of a split-second accident at work, something he'd done safely countless times before. We were still trying to wrap our heads around that loss when life did what it sometimes does and proved it could get even crueler. Exactly 6 months later, my brother died. He was also 30. That alone feels impossible to say out loud. 2 men in the same family, the same age, gone within half a year of each other. It feels like a bad statistic, something you'd hear about another family, not your own. That day, my brother let me borrow his car. I don't remember why, but I remember the fact clearly because it's one of those details that sticks and refuses to let go. He decided to take my new moped instead. He wanted to go buy a helmet, something responsible, something safe, something meant to protect him. He never made it back. A woman driving a new Corvette passed on the right, illegally, into the bike lane. She hit him. He wasn't killed instantly. He was alive when help arrived, but his injuries were too severe. He died at the scene. There's something especially brutal about knowing he was doing the right thing. Going to buy safety equipment, riding carefully enough to be in the bike lane, following the rules. And still, it wasn't enough. The phrase, wrong place at the wrong time, doesn't even begin to cover it. 6 months. That's all the time between losing my cousin and losing my brother. The family barely had time to breathe between funerals, barely had time to process one loss before being crushed by another. It felt like grief stacked on top of grief, with no space in between. Just constant shock, constant sorrow, constant disbelief. Losing one person that young changes a family. Losing 2 feels like something fractures permanently. Holidays felt wrong. Birthdays were unbearable. 30 became a cursed number in our minds. Even though we knew that wasn't rational. You start noticing patterns that don't mean anything. But your brain looks for meaning anyway because accepting randomness feels impossible. What makes it harder is how different the deaths were. One was a workplace accident involving electricity, metal, and a job that demands absolute precision. The other was a traffic accident involving speed, entitlement, and a moment of reckless driving. 2 completely different situations, 2 completely different causes, and yet the outcome was the same. Both men left their homes expecting to come back. Neither did. There's also guilt woven into grief in ways people don't always talk about. I think about my cousin's partner on the pole and what he must have carried afterward. I think about my brother letting me use his car. I think about all the tiny decisions that led to those moments. None of them wrong, none of them malicious. Just ordinary choices that happened to line up with catastrophe. That kind of grief makes you hyper-aware of how fragile life really is. You stop assuming you'll see people again. You stop saying later so casually. You notice how many things we treat as guaranteed when they're anything but. You realize how quickly a family can be rewritten by events no one could have predicted or prevented. The hardest part is that there's no lesson that makes it okay. People want there to be one. They want tragedy to come with wisdom that balances the scale somehow. But sometimes all you're left with is loss. Sometimes all you can do is carry it and keep going because there's no alternative. Our family lost two 30-year-olds in 6 months. 2 lives full of potential, routines, plans, and futures that never happened. That kind of loss doesn't fade. It doesn't resolve. It just becomes part of the family's story, something that quietly shapes everyone who lived through it, something you feel most sharply in moments of joy, when you notice who isn't there to share it. Even now, when I think about it, it still feels wrong, still feels unfair in a way words don't quite reach. It's not dramatic or mysterious in the way some stories are. It's just devastating in its simplicity. One accident at work, one accident on the road, 6 months apart, and a family forever changed. I had just moved into a new house, one of those places that looks perfectly normal from the outside. Nothing about it felt off at first. It wasn't old in a dramatic way, not falling apart or creepy. Just a house, new walls, new rooms, new routines. I was starting over as a single dad with 3 kids, trying to make something stable and safe for them. A fresh start. That was the whole point. About a week after moving in, I got a dog, a black lab. She was great right away. Friendly, energetic, gentle with the kids. The kind of dog that instantly feels like part of the family. I remember thinking how good it felt to have her there, like the house finally had a heartbeat, something living, something warm. I didn't realize then how important that detail would become. Another week passed, and that's when the weird stuff started. At first, it was small, easy to brush off. I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that didn't quite line up with where the light was coming from. I told myself it was just adjusting to a new space, new angles, new windows, new reflections. When you move, your brain needs time to map everything out again. That's what I told myself. But one night I saw a shadow that didn't feel random. It was clearly shaped like a little girl. She had what looked like curly hair, the outline of it unmistakable. She wasn't right in front of me, just there for a moment, standing where a shadow shouldn't be. I froze, stared, and then it was gone. My first instinct wasn't panic, it was denial. I told myself I was tired, stressed, seeing patterns where there weren't any. I chose to ignore it because ignoring it felt safer than asking questions. Then there was the dog. One night she was in her kennel in the living room. She usually slept quietly, maybe a little whining at first, but nothing unusual. I was in my bedroom when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It sounded like a little girl, not loud, not screaming, just talking softly the way kids do when they're being gentle. I could hear words, simple ones, things like "good girl." The tone was affectionate, playful. At the same time, my dog started squealing in that high-pitched way dogs do when they're excited or overwhelmed. Not aggressive, not scared barking, something else. My brain tried to catch up. There shouldn't have been a little girl in the living room. All my kids were in their beds. I didn't walk. I ran. I ran as fast as I could into the living room, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The kennel was there. My dog was there. She was standing, tail going, clearly reacting to something. But there was no one else. No little girl, no movement, no sound, just empty space. I stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, scanning every corner of the room. Nothing. The house felt quiet again, almost too quiet. I checked the doors, locked, windows closed. There was no logical explanation, and that was what scared me the most. I didn't sleep much after that. Over the next week, things escalated. It stopped being just me. That's when I knew I couldn't explain it away anymore. One night, my daughter came into my room. She was shaking, clearly upset. She said she couldn't sleep because there was something in her room. Not a noise, not a shadow this time. Just something. The way kids say it when they don't have the words, but no, it's wrong. I went back with her, turned on the light, looked everywhere, under the bed, in the closet, behind the door, nothing, but the air in the room felt heavy, still, like the room was holding its breath. I tried to reassure her, told her it was okay, that nothing was there, that sometimes moving into a new house makes everything feel strange. I didn't tell her about what I'd seen. I didn't tell her about the voice. I didn't want to plant fear in her head, but I could see it in her eyes. She already felt it. Over the next few nights, my kids started acting differently. Trouble sleeping, wanting lights left on, asking to sleep closer to me. My dog wouldn't settle at night either. She'd stare at empty spaces, ears perked, reacting to things I couldn't see. She'd whine softly, the kind of sound that makes you feel helpless because you don't know how to fix whatever is bothering them. I stopped trying to rationalize it. I didn't need proof. I didn't need to understand what it was. All I knew was that something was wrong, and whatever it wasn't just affecting me anymore. It was affecting my kids. That was the line. As a parent, you can handle fear for yourself. You can push through it. You can tell yourself you're imagining things. But when your children are involved, when they're scared in their own home, that's not something you gamble with. We moved the next week, fast, no hesitation, no second guessing. I didn't care about leases or inconvenience or money. None of that mattered. What mattered was getting my kids out of that house. Getting them somewhere they could sleep without fear, somewhere I didn't feel like I had to be on constant alert. The night we left, I felt relief the moment we crossed the threshold for the last time, like pressure releasing from my chest, like whatever had been watching or lingering no longer had access to us. Nothing followed us. In the new place, everything went back to normal. My kids slept through the night. My dog relaxed. No shadows, no voices, no unexplained fear. Just a house that felt like a house. I don't know what was in that first one. I don't know if it was something supernatural or stress or coincidence layered on top of exhaustion and change. I don't pretend to have answers, but I know what I experienced. I know what my kids experienced, and I know that the fear was real, regardless of the explanation. Some places don't want you there. Some places let you know, and when they do, the smartest thing you can do is leave. My father was only about 7 years old when this happened, still young enough to see the world in a simple, trusting way, where adults were always supposed to have answers, and the line between what was possible and impossible wasn't fully drawn yet. At that age, memories don't always form as clear stories. They come as feelings, flashes, and moments that stick for reasons you don't understand until much later. This is one of those memories for him. Even now, decades later, he remembers it with a clarity that surprises him. not because it was frightening, but because of how quietly heavy it was. On that day, his parents told him they were going out for a while. They didn't explain much, just that they needed to take care of something and that he would be staying home with a babysitter. That wasn't unusual. Kids don't question those things. You accept what you're told, especially when you're 7. He remembers feeling slightly disappointed because he liked when his parents were around, but not upset enough to protest. He just nodded, grabbed a toy, and went about his evening. What his parents didn't tell him was where they were really going. They had decided not to burden him with it. His grandfather had passed away 2 days earlier, and that night was the funeral. They thought he was too young to understand death in a meaningful way, and they didn't want to confuse or upset him. In their minds, it was kinder to shield him from it for the time being, to let him stay home, safe and unaware, while they said their goodbyes. The evening itself was unremarkable. The babysitter made sure he ate, watched him play, and eventually told him it was time to get ready for bed. The house felt quieter than usual, but that wasn't strange either. Houses always feel different when parents aren't home. Sounds seem louder, shadows seem longer, but nothing about it felt scary to him. It was just another night. He brushed his teeth, changed into pajamas, and climbed into bed. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp. He remembers lying there, staring at the ceiling, letting his thoughts drift the way children's thoughts do, jumping from one thing to another without much logic. He wasn't thinking about his grandfather. In fact, he hadn't been told there was anything wrong at all. As far as he knew, everything in his world was exactly as it had always been. Then, without any warning, his bedroom door opened. He didn't feel fear when it happened. That's something he's always been very clear about. There was no sense of danger, no feeling that something was wrong. When he looked up, he saw his grandfather standing in the doorway. Not sick, not weak, just the way he always remembered him. Calm, familiar, solid. The kind of presence that makes you feel safe without even trying. His grandfather walked into the room and sat near the bed. My father remembers the details vividly, the way he stood, the way his voice sounded, not loud, not dramatic, just gentle and steady. He spoke to him the way adults speak to children when they want to be understood, not talked down to. He told my father to stay strong. He told him to live a good life. He didn't say much more than that. There were no long speeches, no warnings, no cryptic messages, just simple words full of care. To a 7-year-old, none of this felt strange. It didn't occur to him to question why his grandfather was there so late at night, or why he hadn't seen him earlier that day. Children accept what they see. If someone you love appears in your room and talks to you kindly, you don't analyze it. You listen. After that, his grandfather stood up and left the room. The door closed. That was it. My father lay there for a while afterward, feeling calm. He didn't feel scared. He didn't cry. He didn't feel confused. If anything, he felt comforted. Eventually, he fell asleep, the way kids do, quickly and completely, without carrying the weight of the moment into his dreams. When his parents came home later that night, the house returned to its normal rhythm. Doors opening, voices in the hallway, the familiar sound of adults moving around. The babysitter left, and my father came out of his room to greet his parents, excited to tell them about something that had happened while they were gone. In his mind, it was just news, something interesting, something worth sharing. He told them that Grandpa had come into his room and talked to him. The reaction was immediate and intense. His parents froze. Their faces changed in a way he had never seen before. What he expected was maybe surprise, maybe confusion, maybe a laugh. What he got instead was fear, shock, a kind of panic that didn't make sense to him at all. They started asking questions right away. What did he say? When did he come? Was he sure it was Grandpa? My father answered honestly, not understanding why this was such a big deal. He told them exactly what his grandfather had said. He described how he looked, how he sounded, how normal it all felt. That's when his parents realized they couldn't avoid the truth anymore. They sat him down and told him something they had been trying to protect him from. They told him that his grandfather had died 2 days earlier, that he hadn't gone anywhere that night, that he couldn't have been there. At 7 years old, that kind of information doesn't land the way it does with adults. My father didn't immediately feel horror or fear. What he felt was confusion. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had heard. And now he was being told that it wasn't possible. His parents were shaken. They didn't know what to think. They didn't accuse him of lying. They could tell he genuinely believed what he was saying. He wasn't making it up. He wasn't joking. He wasn't trying to get attention. He was just telling them about something that, to him, had been completely real. That night changed the way his parents looked at him, and maybe the way they looked at the world. They never fully explained it away. They didn't tell him it was just a dream or his imagination. They didn't insist he was wrong. They just accepted that something had happened that they couldn't explain. As my father grew older, the memory stayed with him. It didn't fade the way most childhood memories do. It stayed sharp, untouched by time. He never doubted it. He never tried to convince himself it was something else. He remembers being awake. He remembers the room. He remembers the words. What makes the story especially sad, rather than frightening, is what his grandfather said. There was no warning, no fear, just encouragement, just love. It feels like a goodbye that my father didn't even know he needed at the time. As an adult, he's thought about it many times. He's wondered if his grandfather somehow knew he needed to say those words. He's wondered if there are moments when people linger just long, enough to comfort the ones they love. He's also wondered if children are simply more open to things adults have learned to ignore or explain away. He doesn't talk about it often, not because he's afraid of it, but because it feels personal, almost sacred. When he does talk about it, his voice changes slightly. It softens. There's sadness there, but also gratitude. He got a goodbye most people never get, even if he didn't understand it at the time. Looking back, his parents never treated the memory as something dark. They never told him to forget it. They never scolded him for it. They respected it, even if it unsettled them. They understood that whatever had happened, it had brought their son comfort, not fear. For my father, the sadness comes from realizing later what that moment truly meant. At 7, he didn't know he was seeing his grandfather for the last time. He didn't know those words were final. As an adult, that understanding adds weight to the memory. It turns a simple childhood moment into something profound. It also changed the way he thinks about death. He doesn't see it as a hard line anymore. He doesn't claim to have answers, and he doesn't try to convince anyone else of anything. But he believes that love doesn't just stop, that sometimes in ways we don't understand, it finds a way to reach back one last time. This story has never scared him. It never gave him nightmares. It never made him afraid of the dark or of being alone. If anything, it did the opposite. It made him feel watched over. It made him feel like he wasn't alone in the world, even during loss. That's why, when he tells it, he always says the same thing. It isn't a scary story, it's a sad one, but it's also a gentle one. A reminder that even in moments of death, there can be kindness. Even in goodbye, there can be reassurance. He spoke to his grandfather after his grandfather had already died, and instead of fear, what he was left with was a quiet sense of strength that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Some people might explain it away as a child's imagination, as a dream, as a coping mechanism. Maybe it was, or maybe it was something else entirely. My father doesn't argue either way. He just knows what he experienced, and he knows how it made him feel. And sometimes That's enough. When my aunt tells this story, she always starts by saying that at the time, none of it felt strange. That's the part that still unsettles me the most. Not the killers, not even the realization afterward, but how normal everything seemed while it was happening. How something horrifying could exist right alongside childhood play without anyone realizing what they were standing next to. This was in the late 1970s when my aunt was a kid. She grew up near the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains in Southern California. Back then, the area felt open and wild in a way that's hard to imagine now. There were fields that hadn't been developed yet, rocky hills, dirt roads, and stretches of land where kids could roam freely without adults constantly watching them. It was the kind of place where children spent entire days outside, riding bikes, climbing rocks, and exploring whatever they found interesting. One of the places my aunt and the neighborhood kids liked to play was a field that ran alongside some rocky hills. Those hills rose up toward the mountains, full of uneven stone, brush, and little hidden spaces that felt like secret worlds to kids. Somewhere along those rocks was a cave, not a deep one, not something you'd get lost in, but big enough for kids to crawl into, sit in, and feel like they'd discovered something special. They called it the Artist's Cave. The reason for the name seemed obvious to them at the time. Inside the cave, hanging over rocks and scattered around, were rags and old shirts covered in red paint. Some were draped over stones, some caught on jagged edges, some just lying there stiff and dried. To a group of kids, the explanation made sense. They assumed an artist came there to paint, maybe to be alone, maybe to work in peace. No one questioned why the paint was only red. No one questioned why someone would paint inside a cave using rags instead of brushes. Kids don't interrogate details the way adults do. They see something, give it a name, and move on. My aunt remembers that the rags looked bright at first, vivid red, but as time passed, some of them darkened. The color changed as they aged, turning brownish, almost black in places. Again, it didn't register as strange. Paint dries, paint changes color. That was the end of the thought. They kept playing there. They climbed in and out of the cave. They touched the rocks. They joked about the artist who must come there at night. It became just another landmark in their childhood landscape, something familiar and unthreatening. At the same time, something else was happening in the area. Teenage girls were going missing. At first, it was just rumors. One missing girl, then another. Parents talked in hushed tones. News reports started appearing. There was fear, but it felt distant to kids. Missing teenagers didn't seem connected to a group of younger children playing in a field. Adults worried, but life continued. People still went to work. Kids still went outside. There was no clear sense yet of what was happening or who was responsible. Eventually, the truth came out. 2 men were arrested for a series of brutal murders. They were later known as Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, collectively referred to as the Toolbox Killers. They had been abducting teenage girls, torturing them, and killing them in horrifying ways. The details of their crimes are among the most disturbing ever recorded, so much so that even decades later, many people can't stomach reading them. One of the details that mattered most to my aunt came out during the investigation. They had been bringing their victims to an abandoned fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains, the same area, the same hills, the same stretch of land where my aunt and her friends had played. As an adult, years later, my aunt remembered the cave. She remembered the rags. She remembered the red paint. And suddenly, the explanation she'd accepted as a child shattered completely. Why would an artist only use red paint? Why would they paint inside a cave, using rags and shirts instead of proper tools? Why would those rags be left hanging and scattered instead of taken away? Why would the red turn so dark as it aged? The realization hit her all at once, years after the fact, and it made her physically ill. Those weren't paint rags. They were almost certainly blood-soaked cloths. The cave wasn't an artist's hideaway. It was likely a place connected to the murders, or at the very least, to the aftermath of them. As children, they had been playing in a space that may have been used by serial killers, touching rocks that may have been splattered with blood, laughing and exploring in a place tied to unimaginable suffering, all while having absolutely no idea. That kind of realization changes how you see your own memories. My aunt said that once she made that connection, she started replaying everything in her head: the smell of the cave, the way the rags felt stiff, the way some of the red looked too dark, too thick, the fact that the cave always felt oddly quiet, even compared to the rest of the hills. At the time, none of it had seemed alarming. In hindsight, every detail felt wrong. What makes this story especially disturbing is how close it all was. The toolbox killers weren't operating in some distant, isolated wilderness far from civilization. They were using areas that were close enough to neighborhoods that children played there during the day. The same land could hold laughter and terror within hours of each other. It also highlights how much danger can exist just out of sight. Kids are taught to fear strangers, dark alleys, obvious threats. But my aunt and her friends weren't doing anything that felt risky. They were playing outside near their homes, in daylight, doing what kids had always done. The danger wasn't obvious. It was hidden in plain sight, disguised by familiarity and assumptions. As an adult, my aunt struggles with the thought of how close she came to something truly horrific without ever knowing it. Not just physically close, but temporally close. The idea that she might have been in that cave hours or days after something terrible happened there is something she can't fully process. It also makes her think about the girls who were taken. Teenagers who likely walked similar paths, lived in similar neighborhoods, maybe even passed by those same hills, without knowing what waited there. The contrast between her own childhood innocence and the brutality inflicted on those girls is something she finds hard to reconcile. For me, hearing this story changed how I think about places. We like to believe that certain spaces are inherently safe or dangerous, that playgrounds are safe, that crime scenes look like crime scenes, that evil leaves obvious marks. But that isn't how reality works. Sometimes the most ordinary places hold the darkest histories, and the people who pass through them never know. It also changed how I think about memory. As kids, we build narratives to make sense of the world. Artist's Cave was a harmless explanation that allowed my aunt and her friends to continue playing without fear. It was a story that protected their sense of safety. Only later, with adult knowledge and context, did that narrative collapse. And once it collapsed, it couldn't be rebuilt. The San Gabriel Mountains still stand there. People still hike those trails. Kids probably still play in nearby fields. Most of them will never know what happened there decades ago. Life moves on, layered over old horrors like fresh paint over a stain. But for my aunt, that place will never be neutral again. Every time she thinks about her childhood, that cave is there, looming in the background of otherwise happy memories, a reminder of how thin the line is between innocence and atrocity, how easily something terrible can be mistaken for something mundane. The toolbox killers were eventually stopped. One died in prison. The other served his sentence. Justice, in a legal sense, was done. But the psychological damage they left behind spread far beyond their direct victims. It reached into communities, into families, into childhood memories that would later be reinterpreted through a lens of horror. My aunt survived her childhood untouched physically. but the knowledge she gained later still wounded something inside her. And that's what stays with me most about this story. Not just the killers or their crimes, but the idea that you can live part of your life in complete innocence, only to discover later that you were standing on the edge of something unspeakable the whole time. It makes you realize how much of safety is perception, and how fragile that perception really is. This happened in my province, in a place that most people drive past without giving much thought to what's actually inside. We have a lot of hydroelectric power dams here. They're part of the landscape. Massive concrete structures sitting quietly in rivers, producing electricity day and night. People talk about them as clean energy, safe energy, reliable energy. They look solid, controlled, almost peaceful from the outside. One of those dams was close to where I lived. At the time, it had gone into scheduled maintenance. Nothing unusual. Turbines need regular inspections. Parts wear down. Systems have to be checked. This kind of work happens all the time, and the procedures are supposed to be extremely strict. Multiple safety systems, lockouts, redundancies, layers of checks designed to make sure nothing can move, nothing can start, nothing can go wrong while people are inside. That's the theory anyway. For this maintenance job, there were two workers who had to go inside the turbine chamber. One was a government worker, experienced, trained, familiar with the site. The other was a contractor from GE, also trained, also experienced. These weren't careless people. They weren't rookies messing around. They were professionals doing exactly what they were supposed to do. There was also a third worker stationed outside. His job was to monitor the situation, stay in communication, and make sure everything stayed locked down while the work was being done. He was their lifeline to the outside world. If something went wrong, he was the one who could raise the alarm and trigger emergency procedures. The two workers inside were checking and maintaining the turbine alternator group. This is the heart of the system. The turbine is enormous, built to be driven by massive volumes of water under incredible pressure. When it's running normally, it spins with controlled force, converting the energy of moving water into electricity. When it's shut down for maintenance, it's supposed to be completely inert. No movement, no flow, no power. They were almost done. From everything that later came out, the job was nearing completion. They were wrapping up, probably thinking about getting out, cleaning up, filling out paperwork, and going home. Just another maintenance task completed. Just another day of work. And then something went wrong. Not a small thing, not a minor issue. Something catastrophic. Somehow, the water inlet partially opened. To this day, the exact chain of failures is still discussed, analyzed, and argued over. Mechanical malfunction, human error, system failure, a combination of factors lining up in the worst possible way. What matters is that the one thing that absolutely should not have happened did happen. Water began rushing into the turbine. Not a full opening at first, but enough. Enough to start the turbine turning. Water under pressure doesn't need permission. It doesn't need speed to be lethal. Even a partial flow carries immense force. The turbine began to move, slowly at first, but movement was already too much. Inside that chamber, there was nowhere safe to stand once things started turning. The workers realized immediately that something was wrong. They tried to get out, but the acceleration was just fast enough to trap them. Not fast enough to instantly kill them, not slow enough to allow escape. The man outside saw it happening. Imagine that position, standing outside, watching indicators change, alarms start, realizing that the turbine is moving when it absolutely should not be, knowing instantly that the people inside are in danger. He tried to contact the control center. He tried to get the inlet closed again, He did everything he could, but systems like this don't respond instantly. Valves take time. Commands have to travel through layers of automation and safety protocols. While all of that was happening, the turbine kept accelerating. Inside, the two men were being carried along with it. A turbine of that size doesn't have smooth, gentle surfaces. It's made of massive blades, steel structures, narrow clearances, and unforgiving geometry. As it turned faster, their bodies were slammed again and again into the machinery. Each rotation increased the speed. Each impact caused more damage. They were alive during this. That's the part that is hardest to process. They didn't die instantly. They were being battered, crushed, torn apart piece by piece as the turbine gained speed. There was nothing they could do. No handholds, no escape route, no emergency stop they could reach. Just unstoppable motion driven by water that should never have been there in the first place. The man outside watched helplessly. He could see what was happening through indicators and systems, maybe through observation points. He knew exactly what it meant. He knew what was happening to his co-workers, and he couldn't stop it fast enough. The feeling of that kind of helplessness is hard to even imagine. Knowing people are dying horribly because of a failure you can't reverse in time. Eventually, the inlet was closed. Eventually, the turbine slowed. Eventually, it stopped. By the time everything finally came to rest, there was nothing recognizable left of the two men as people. What remained was described as a bloody mess. Flesh, torn clothing, broken equipment, parts of bodies crushed beyond recognition. The force involved had reduced them to fragments. There were no intact forms, no peaceful stillness, just destruction inside a machine that was never meant to have human beings inside while moving. The story made headlines. It couldn't not. It was too horrific. 2 workers killed in one of the worst industrial accidents imaginable on government property in a facility that was supposed to be safe by design. Investigations were launched immediately. Reports were written. Press conferences were held. Promises were made about reviewing procedures, improving safety, making sure something like this could never happen again. But headlines fade. Reports get filed away. People move on. What stayed with me was something else. I met the cleanup worker. Not long after the incident, I crossed paths with the person who had been part of the cleanup operation. The job no one wants. The job that happens after everyone else leaves. After the investigators, after the media, after the officials. The job of going inside and dealing with what's left. He told me about it. Not in graphic detail meant to shock, but in the flat, exhausted way people talk when they've seen something that changed them. He talked about the smell, the amount of blood, the way it coated surfaces you wouldn't expect, the difficulty of figuring out what was equipment and what was once part of a person, the fact that there was no way to clean it quickly or easily. It took time, care, a level of emotional detachment that doesn't come naturally. He said it stayed with him, not just the visuals, but the knowledge of how it happened, that these men were doing their jobs, that they trusted the systems, that they were almost done, that they probably thought they'd be home that night. Hearing that secondhand was enough to make my stomach turn. It made the whole thing feel real in a way news articles never do. Industrial accidents often get reduced to statistics. 2 dead. System failure, investigation ongoing, safety protocols reviewed. But behind those words are human beings who experienced absolute terror and pain in their final moments. And behind them are families who got phone calls that changed their lives forever. It also changed how I look at places like dams. From the outside, they still look calm, still look controlled, still look safe. But now I know what kind of forces they hold inside. I know how thin the margin for error really is, how much trust is placed in systems working perfectly every single time. I think about the man who was outside, the one who watched it happen. I can't imagine how he lives with that memory. Knowing you did everything you could and it still wasn't enough. Knowing you watched co-workers die in one of the worst ways imaginable. That kind of trauma doesn't just go away. I think about the cleanup worker going home afterward, trying to eat dinner, trying to sleep, carrying images that don't belong in normal life. And I think about the families of the two men, how they had to hear what happened, how much of it they were told, how much was spared, how they had to accept that their loved ones didn't just die, but died violently, painfully, and senselessly. This wasn't a freak storm or an act of nature. It was a chain of failures. And that's what makes it so disturbing, because chains of failures can happen again. Every time I drive past a dam now, I don't just see concrete and water. I see pressure, motion, energy waiting to be released. I think about how many people work inside these places every day, trusting procedures, trusting locks, trusting that nothing will go wrong. Most of the time, they're right. But sometimes something goes really wrong. And when it does, there's no undo button. This story stuck with me not because it's supernatural or mysterious, but because it's brutally real. It's a reminder that some of the most horrifying deaths don't come from monsters or criminals, but from machines doing exactly what they're designed to do at the wrong moment. Two men went into that turbine chamber expecting to finish a job. They never came out. And the people who saw the aftermath will carry it for the rest of their lives. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. I heard this story through the old guys, the ones who had been in fire and EMS long enough that nothing surprised them anymore. These were people who had seen things most of us can't imagine. People who didn't exaggerate or dramatize because they didn't need to. When something stuck with them, you paid attention. This story stuck with all of them. The call came in as routine, about as routine as it gets. It was a Class 3 fall, the lowest severity. No lights, no sirens, no urgency in the dispatch tone. The kind of call you barely register as anything more than paperwork and a quick patient assessment. This was in a rough part of the city, the kind of neighborhood where buildings were old. Stairwells smelled like urine and stale smoke, and everyone kept their heads down. Still, nothing about the call suggested danger. This was also before the days of portable radios. That detail matters more than you'd think. Communication wasn't instant. Once you went inside, you were on your own unless you physically left the scene to make a call. 2 EMTs responded and went inside the apartment building. The place was exactly what you'd expect. Dim lighting, cracked walls, the kind of silence that feels wrong because it's not peaceful, it's watchful. They knocked, entered, and immediately saw a man lying face down on the floor of the apartment. He was wearing a suit which already didn't fit the environment. He wasn't moving. No obvious signs of trauma from where they were standing, just unconscious. EMT1 approached him to do a basic assessment. As he lifted the man's jacket to check for injuries or signs of breathing, he froze. Under the jacket was a badge. Handcuffs, a shoulder holster, and an empty space where a gun should have been. In that moment, the entire call changed. This wasn't a random fall victim. This was a detective, someone armed, someone trained, someone who should not be unconscious on the floor of an apartment in that neighborhood without his weapon. EMT1 didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't shout. He just stood up and looked at EMT2, and they both understood instantly that they were not supposed to be there anymore. EMT2 turned around and ran. No heroics, no hesitation. He bolted out of the apartment and went straight to call law enforcement. EMT1 followed right behind him. They abandoned the scene completely, leaving the unconscious detective exactly where he was. It wasn't negligence, it was survival. They had walked into something they were not equipped to handle. Only after law enforcement secured the scene did the full story come out. There weren't one, but two patients. Both were detectives. They had been working a missing person case. I don't remember if they were city police or private investigators, but they were legitimate. They had followed a lead that brought them to that exact apartment. At the time, the man who lived there wasn't even considered a suspect. He was just someone they wanted to talk to, someone who might have known something. They went inside casually. No raid, no backup, no expectation of violence. The detectives started walking through the apartment, asking questions, looking around. At some point, one of them opened a closet door. Inside the closet was the missing person, dead, long dead. Hidden away like an object that had been forgotten. That's when everything exploded. The man who lived in the apartment pulled a gun. He shot the first detective almost immediately. That was the man EMT1 had found unconscious on the floor. His partner reacted fast enough to run, adrenaline and training kicking in at once. He made it out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the building's common area. Then his body caught up with reality. He realized he had been shot too. He collapsed at the bottom of the stairs. Both detectives survived, somehow, against odds that honestly feel unfair given the circumstances. They lived, but the outcome could have been very different with just a few seconds difference in timing. The thing that stayed with the EMTs wasn't just the danger, it was the layers. They were dispatched for a simple fall. They walked into a scene involving a homicide victim hidden in a closet, an armed suspect, two detectives shot at close range, and a missing gun. If EMT1 had stayed a few seconds longer, if EMT2 had tried to help instead of running, if either of them had made the wrong call, they could have been killed without ever understanding why. What made it worse was how quiet it all was. No screaming, no warning, just an unconscious man on the floor and a subtle detail under a jacket that changed everything. Violence had already happened, and more could have happened again at any second. The old guys always said the same thing after telling this story. Calls don't tell the truth. Dispatch information is just a guess. A label slapped on chaos so it can be sent somewhere. A fall can be a shooting. A medical can be a murder scene. You don't actually know what you're walking into until you're already inside it. This story stuck with me because it perfectly captures that idea. Two EMTs did everything right and still came inches from disaster. Two detectives followed a lead that seemed harmless and nearly died because of it. A missing person case turned into a gunfight in a cramped apartment. A closet door changed everything. It really did feel like something out of a crime novel. The kind of story you'd think was exaggerated if you didn't know better. But the way it was told, without drama, without embellishment, made it worse. These weren't storytellers trying to scare someone. These were professionals recounting something that shook even them. There's a reason first responders develop a certain edge over time. It's not cynicism for the sake of it, it's awareness. The understanding that danger doesn't announce itself, that it often hides behind routine, paperwork, and low-priority calls. That story still sits in my head whenever I think about how thin the line really is, how quickly ordinary situations can turn lethal, how sometimes the only thing that saves you is noticing a detail at exactly the right moment and having the sense to leave. Because if that badge hadn't been seen, if that empty holster hadn't stood out, this would have been a very different story. When I was younger, I grew up around farms and rural work, so heavy machinery, animals, and dangerous jobs were just part of the background of everyday life. As a kid, you don't really think about how risky it all is. You see adults doing these things day after day, and because they keep surviving them, you assume they always will. It takes moments like these to break that illusion. There were two brothers who worked together harvesting alfalfa. I don't remember every technical detail of what they were doing that day, but I remember enough to understand how it happened. The younger brother was driving the tractor, sitting inside the cab, focused on steering it through the field. The older brother was outside the cab, standing on part of the tractor and directing him, guiding where to go and how to line things up. This kind of setup wasn't unusual back then. People trusted experience and familiarity more than strict safety rules. At some point, the older brother lost his footing. It happened fast. He fell from the tractor straight into the worst possible place. He went under the massive rear wheel, the kind that's taller than a person and weighs more than you can really comprehend until you see one up close. The younger brother realized what was happening almost immediately, but by then it was already too late. Tractors don't stop on a dime. There's momentum, weight, lag between reaction and response. He ran over his own brother. The wheel crushed him before the tractor could be stopped. There was nothing the younger brother could do to save him. No amount of skill, no quick thinking, no strength could undo the physics of that moment. 1 second they were working together like they probably had hundreds of times before. The next, one brother was dead, and the other had to live with the knowledge that he was the one driving. That kind of thing doesn't just kill one person. It destroys entire families in quieter, longer-lasting ways. I've always wondered what it must be like to wake up every day knowing the last thing you did with your sibling was accidentally end their life. That's not something you ever get over. You just learn how to carry it. Not long after that, there was another tragedy that shook the area. A bus full of kids was heading up north for a field trip. It was supposed to be one of those exciting days kids talk about for weeks beforehand. They were in the mountains when it happened. A snowplow swiped the bus, whether from poor visibility, slick roads, or a moment of misjudgment. I don't know for sure. The impact was enough to make the bus overturn. Chaos followed. Some kids died at the scene. Others were badly injured and rushed to the hospital. Families got phone calls no parent should ever receive. The kind that instantly divides life into before and after. For the kids who survived, that day never really left them. A school bus is supposed to be safe. A field trip is supposed to be harmless. After that, even something as normal as riding in a bus felt different. But the story that stays with me the most happened even earlier, back on the dairy farm. This was years before the harvester incident. My grandfather was on calving duty, something he had done countless times before. Calving is hard work, but for experienced farmers, it's routine. You learn to read the animals, to know when to let nature take its course and when to step in. That day, a cow was having trouble dropping her calf. She wasn't pushing hard enough, or maybe she was exhausted. Either way, the calf wasn't coming out on its own. No problem, or so it seemed. This was exactly the kind of situation my grandfather had handled hundreds of times. The process involved attaching chains to the calf's front legs. Those chains connected to a wrench system designed to help pull the calf out safely and steadily. Between the chains and the wrench was a metal fastener that locked everything together. It was a simple piece, small compared to the rest of the equipment, but absolutely critical. My grandfather was positioning everything the way he always did. The cow was restrained. The chains were on. The wrench system was ready. All that was left was securing that fastener. Something went wrong. I don't know if the fastener was worn, improperly seated, or defective. Maybe it was metal fatigue. Maybe it had a hairline crack no one could see. But when tension was applied, it failed. It snapped violently under pressure. When it broke, all that force had to go somewhere. The wrench system recoiled instantly, whipping back with incredible speed and power. My grandfather didn't have time to react. It struck him hard with the full force of the tension that had been built up in the system. The impact was catastrophic. Even writing about it feels unreal because, again, this wasn't someone being careless or reckless. This was a man doing a job he had done safely over and over again, trusting equipment that had always worked before. One failed piece was all it took. What connects all of these stories, at least for me, is how ordinary they started. Brothers working a field together, kids heading out on a school trip, a farmer helping a cow give birth. None of these moments felt dangerous while they were happening. They were normal, familiar, almost boring in how routine they were. That's what makes the aftermath so hard to accept. There's a lie we tell ourselves, especially in rural or working environments, that experience makes you immune. That because you've done something 1,000 times, the 1,001st time will be fine too. Most of the time, that's true. But all it takes is one slip, one mechanical failure, 1 second of bad timing. After growing up around stories like these, I stopped believing in the idea of freak accidents as rare, abstract things. They're not freaks. They're the result of everyday risks finally lining up in the worst possible way. And when they do, the damage isn't contained to the moment. It ripples outward into families, communities, and memories that never quite fade. I still think about that younger brother on the tractor, about the kids on that bus, about my grandfather trusting a piece of equipment that had never failed him before. None of them woke up that day expecting disaster. None of them thought, today is the day something irreversible happens. But it did. And once you've seen how quickly life can turn like that, it's hard to ever look at routine work, travel, or even family moments the same way again. This happened years ago, but it's one of those moments that never really loses its edge when I think back on it. Not because anything actually happened, but because of how close it felt to going very wrong, and how powerless we felt in the middle of it. A friend and I had just gotten out of a movie. It was late enough that the crowd from the theater had thinned, but not so late that the streets were empty. The kind of time where you still expect things to feel normal. We were relaxed, talking about the movie, doing that slow post-movie walk where your brain is still half in the story you just watched. That's when the two guys approached us. At first, it didn't register as threatening. They were just odd. They came up too close, too fast, and immediately started talking. They were holding a large cardboard pizza box, like the kind a full pie comes in. The box had a logo on it, but it was from a pizzeria I'd never heard of, and something about it felt off. It looked old, worn, like it had been handled a lot. They kept insisting we buy it, not pizza, the box. They weren't saying there was pizza inside. They weren't offering food. They just kept yelling over and over for us to buy the pizza box. The way they said it wasn't playful or joking. It was aggressive, almost desperate. Their voices were loud enough to draw attention, but not loud enough to bring anyone over to intervene. We told them no and tried to walk away. They followed us. At that point, the unease turned into real fear. They weren't letting it go. They stayed right behind us, still shouting, still insisting we buy the box. Every time we sped up, they sped up. Every time we slowed down, they stayed close. They weren't touching us, but the distance was uncomfortably small, like they were testing how far they could push it. I remember scanning constantly for police. There were none. No patrol cars, no officers on foot, just people scattered here and there, moving through their own nights, not really paying attention. We stuck to well-lit public areas, doing everything we could think of to avoid getting cornered. We didn't want to duck down a side street or cut through anything quiet. We stayed where there were people, even if no one was actively helping. The guys kept yelling. It didn't make sense. Why a pizza box? What did they want? Was it a distraction, a scam, something worse? Not knowing was part of what made it so frightening. If they had been asking for money, at least that would have been familiar. This felt unpredictable, and unpredictability is terrifying. When we got closer to the subway, the panic really set in. We knew that once we went underground, options would narrow. Platforms can be isolated, trains come and go quickly. If they followed us down there, we'd have fewer places to move, fewer exits. At the same time, the subway was the only real way out. We made a split-second decision. When a train came in, we broke in different directions. Not planned, just instinct. I jumped onto one train as the doors were closing. My friend ran for another just a few feet away, barely making it before those doors shut too. Through the windows, I saw them on the platform. They didn't get on either train. That was the first moment I felt like I could breathe again. The ride felt endless, even though it wasn't. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, wondering what would have happened if we'd stopped, if we'd argued, if we'd tried to confront them instead of just moving. I didn't relax until I was off the train, up on the street again, surrounded by people. The first thing I did was call my friend. When he answered and told me he was okay, that he'd made it home safely, the tension finally drained out of my body. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding myself together until that moment. My hands were shaking, my jaw hurt from being clenched. Nothing technically happened, no assault, no robbery, no crime that could be easily described or reported, but the fear was real. The feeling of being hunted, even briefly, sticks with you in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. It's not about what they did. It's about what they might have done and how little control you feel in that moment. To this day, it's the only time I've ever been stalked like that. I've walked through sketchy areas. I've dealt with drunk strangers. I've had uncomfortable encounters. None of them compare to the sustained, deliberate following, the way they locked onto us and refused to let go. The pizza box itself almost makes it worse in hindsight, because it was so strange, so meaningless on the surface. It felt like a prop in something we didn't understand. Even now, years later, whenever I leave a movie late at night or walk toward a subway, I think about that night. I'm more aware of who's behind me. I notice footsteps. I plan exits without realizing I'm doing it. Nothing bad happened. But it came close enough to remind me how fast an ordinary night can turn into something else, and how sometimes the scariest situations are the ones where there's no clear motive, no clear demand, and no clear end in sight. I was very young when this happened, 5 or 6 years old, but the memory has never faded. It's one of those moments that settles into you quietly and then stays there for life. Not because it was dramatic in the way movies are dramatic, but because of how close it came to ending everything, before I even understood what danger really was. My mom and I had shown up to visit my dad at the dairy where he worked. This was a different dairy than the ones he worked at before or after, but the work was similar. Long hours, heavy machinery, loud engines, and routines that everyone there followed almost automatically. It wasn't unusual for us to stop by. My dad liked seeing us, and my mom liked bringing me along so I could wave to him and watch him work for a bit before we went home. That day, my dad was preparing feed for the cows. The process was simple but dangerous if you weren't paying attention. He was using a large front-load tractor, driving back and forth between different piles of feed ingredients. He'd scoop up one type of feed, drive over, dump it into the back of a truck that had a mixer attached, then repeat the process until everything was combined properly. The mixer truck would then distribute the feed to the cows. Those tractors are massive, loud, heavy. They don't move quickly, but when they move, nothing small stands a chance against them. From the outside, they look slow and controlled. From inside the cab, you're surrounded by noise, vibration, and blind spots. We pulled into the lot in our pickup truck and parked at a distance at first. I remember sitting in the passenger seat, looking out the window at the piles of feed and the big machinery, feeling small in comparison. My dad noticed us and gave a wave from the tractor. I remember that wave clearly. It felt reassuring, like everything was normal. What happened next still doesn't make sense to me, even all these years later. My mom has admitted many times that what she did was incredibly stupid. She doesn't try to excuse it. She says she genuinely thought my dad was finished and that he had signaled that he was done and about to park the tractor. Maybe she misread his wave. Maybe she assumed. Maybe she was distracted. Whatever the reason, she decided to drive our truck closer. She pulled forward into the food lot and parked directly behind my dad's tractor. That decision alone still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. My dad had no idea we were there. From his perspective, his wife and kid were still safely parked off to the side, far away from where he was working. He had no reason to check behind him for us. No reason at all. From my mom's perspective, she thought my dad saw us. She thought he was done. She thought he was joking around the way he often did. My dad had a history of joking like that. He liked to scare my mom in harmless ways, doing donuts in the snow, speeding up a little too much on empty country roads, pretending to do something reckless and then laughing afterward. With me, he'd pretend to fall asleep while driving a tractor and tell me I had to steer until he woke up. It was all play, no real danger. At least, that's how it felt at the time. So when my dad started backing the tractor up, my mom laughed. She thought he was messing with her. I remember the sound first, a sudden jolt. A deep, heavy thump that didn't sound like anything I'd heard before. The tractor hit our truck. The impact shoved the truck sideways and pushed it several feet across the lot. Inside the cab, everything lurched at once. I remember my mom screaming, not in fear at first, but in shock and surprise. I remember my body being thrown sideways in my seat. I remember looking out the window and seeing the ground, the dirt, way too close, like the truck was tipping. For a few seconds, I thought we were rolling over. The truck tilted enough that I could see the ground through my window at an angle that didn't make sense. Everything felt slow and fast at the same time. Then the truck slammed back down onto all four wheels. It didn't roll. That fact alone still feels unreal to me. There was a massive dent in the driver's side door where the tractor had hit us. The metal was crushed inward, warped and torn in a way that made it obvious how much force had been involved. If the angle had been slightly different, if the tractor had pushed just a little higher or a little harder, the truck could have rolled completely. My dad didn't stop immediately. That part is important, and it's something people who haven't worked with heavy machinery don't always understand. Tractors like that are loud. The engines roar constantly. The cab vibrates. When you're moving backward with a loaded bucket, you feel all kinds of shifts and lurches as the weight moves. A sudden resistance doesn't automatically register as I've hit a vehicle. To my dad, that initial impact felt like something settling. Maybe the load shifted. Maybe the bucket moved. He didn't hear us scream. He didn't see us. He didn't know. He kept backing up. By the time he realized something was wrong, he had already pushed our truck several feet from where it had been parked. When he finally stopped and turned around, the realization hit him all at once. He nearly lost us. I remember him jumping down from the tractor, his face drained of color, his movements frantic. My mom was crying now, real crying, not laughing anymore. I don't remember crying myself, which is strange because I usually cried in scary situations. I just remember sitting there, quiet, staring at the dented door, staring at my dad, trying to understand what had just happened. Everyone was shaken. My dad kept apologizing over and over, even though it wasn't his fault. My mom kept saying it was her mistake. that she shouldn't have driven back there, that she thought he saw us. The adults were talking fast, voices overlapping, adrenaline still pumping through them. What stuck with me wasn't the noise or the yelling. It was the realization that my dad hadn't seen us. He wasn't joking. This wasn't play. If he had backed up a little more, if the angle had been worse, if the truck had rolled, if the dent had been just a little deeper, if my mom had parked a few feet closer, if any of those small details had been different, I might not be here. As a kid, you don't immediately process things like that. You just know something bad almost happened. But the older I got, the more that moment replayed itself in my mind, each time with more understanding. I started thinking about how loud tractors are, how limited visibility is, how dangerous farms actually are, especially for kids. I learned later that farm accidents are some of the most common and deadly accidents involving children, precisely because of situations like this. Familiarity breeds comfort. Comfort breeds mistakes. At the time, my dad trusted that his family was where they were supposed to be. My mom trusted that my dad saw us. Both assumptions were wrong, and only luck prevented tragedy. What scares me the most is how ordinary it all felt leading up to it. There was no warning, no gut feeling, no sense that we were doing something dangerous. Just a visit, a wave, a truck pulling forward, a laugh, and then violence, sudden and mechanical and indifferent. The tractor didn't care who was behind it. Physics didn't care that I was a kid. Metal doesn't stop because of intention. That's something I learned much later, but the lesson was planted that day. I think about how easily this could have been one of those stories people tell in hushed voices, a remember when that ends with silence. I think about how my dad might have lived the rest of his life carrying that guilt, even though it wasn't intentional. I think about how my mom would have blamed herself forever for making that choice. I think about how I don't really remember the rest of that day clearly, just fragments, being driven home, adults talking quietly, the sound of doors closing, the way everyone seemed slower afterward, like the world had tilted slightly and never fully leveled out again. What still confuses me, just like with other moments in my childhood, is why I didn't cry. I remember fear, but I also remember being strangely calm, almost detached, like my body went into some kind of quiet survival mode. That reaction has followed me into adulthood more than I realized at first. When something terrifying happens, I don't always react the way people expect. I go quiet, I observe, I freeze internally and process later. That day may have been the first time that part of me activated. As an adult, I understand now how close we came. A front-load tractor has enough power to crush vehicles. People die in accidents like that all the time, not because someone was reckless or evil, but because assumptions overlapped at the wrong moment. My dad never joked the same way again after that. The donuts in the snow stopped. The fake falling asleep stopped. The playful scares stopped. I don't think he ever said it out loud, but something in him changed. He understood, suddenly and deeply, how thin the line was between fun and catastrophe. My mom changed too. She became far more cautious around machinery, around farms, around anything heavy and loud. She still talks about that moment sometimes, shaking her head, saying she can't believe she did something so dangerous. I always tell her the same thing. We all make mistakes. Not all of us are forced to see how close they came to killing someone we love. For me, that memory sits alongside all the other moments where luck intervened, where something unseen caught us before we hit the ground, where a second or two made all the difference. I don't think about it every day, but when I hear heavy machinery, when I see tractors backing up, when I hear stories about farm accidents, when I think about how easily kids can be hurt in places adults assume are safe, it comes back. I think about the floor tilting outside my window. I think about the dent in the door. I think about how my dad didn't see us, and I think about how different my life could have been if that tractor had backed up just a little more. Where I live used to be a steel industry town, the kind of place where everything revolved around the mills. For decades, steel was the heartbeat of the area. People didn't just work there, they built their entire lives around it. Fathers worked the mills, their sons followed them in, and sometimes even their grandsons ended up on the same floors, breathing the same air, learning the same routines. The town itself was shaped by steel. The roads, the rail lines, the old brick buildings, even the way people talked and carried themselves, all seemed to come from that hard, industrial past. Back then, the mills were massive, loud, and dangerous in ways that most people today can barely imagine. Safety standards existed, but they weren't what they are now. A lot of things were done based on routine, trust, and experience rather than strict lockout procedures or electronic safeguards. People relied on each other to communicate, to double-check, to remember who was where and what was happening. Most days that system worked, and then there were days when it didn't. One of those days became a story that never really left this town. There was a man who worked inside the plant, someone like countless others who clocked in, did his job, and expected to go home afterward. From what I've been told, he wasn't reckless. He wasn't new or careless. He was just doing a task that needed to be done. Inside the steel mill were these enormous vats used in the process of handling molten steel. They were large, reverse dome-shaped structures, huge enough that a person could stand inside them. If you've ever seen Star Wars, Attack of the Clones, there's a scene where Padme and Anakin end up trapped inside one of those industrial-looking domes. People always use that comparison because it's almost identical. A massive, curved metal chamber, smooth on the inside, built to hold extreme heat and unimaginable force. These vats had to be cleaned periodically. Slag, residue, and buildup would collect inside them, and someone had to go in and scrape it out. It was dirty, exhausting work, but it was part of the job. On this particular day, that man was assigned to clean one of the vats. He climbed inside, probably thinking about nothing more than getting the task done and moving on to the next thing. Somewhere else in the plant, someone else was working their own shift. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe there was a miscommunication. No one knows exactly what went wrong, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the story so haunting. At some point, the system that fills those vats with molten steel was turned on. The man was still inside. There was no dramatic warning, no siren that gave him time to escape, no last-second rescue. Once the process began, there was nothing anyone could do. Molten steel isn't like fire where you might have a moment to react. It's instant, overwhelming, and absolute. The heat alone is beyond comprehension. People who have worked around steel will tell you that even standing near it can be unbearable. Being inside a vat as it fills is something the human body simply cannot survive. He was melted alive. There's no gentle way to say that. No version of the story that makes it less horrific. He didn't die somewhere hidden away or quietly. He died inside the machine he worked with every day in one of the most violent industrial deaths imaginable. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it was already far too late. They never recovered his body. There was nothing to recover. His remains became part of the vat itself, fused into the steel, inseparable from the structure. The machine that killed him could not be dismantled in a way that would remove what was left of him without destroying it entirely. And so he stayed there. Over time, the vat stopped being just another piece of equipment. It became something else. The company, the workers, and eventually, the town began to treat it as a memorial. Not in a flashy or ceremonial way, but quietly, respectfully. People knew what it was. They knew what had happened there. New workers were told the story as a warning, not just about safety, but about how unforgiving the work could be. That vat is still there. It's no longer used the same way it once was, but it hasn't been removed. People say his remains are still inside it, part of the metal, part of the structure. Whether that's literally true in a physical sense or symbolic in how people think about it, almost doesn't matter anymore. In this town, that vat is him. What makes the story especially unsettling is how normal everything was before it happened. It wasn't a disaster caused by an explosion or a collapse that everyone saw coming. It was a routine task on a regular workday, the kind of thing that had been done countless times before. That's what makes it stick in people's minds. If something like that can happen on an ordinary day, then no day is ever completely safe. Older workers still talk about it in low voices. They don't dramatize it. They don't embellish it. They just state the facts and then go quiet. You can tell it affected them deeply, even those who weren't there at the time. In a town like this, stories like that get passed down the same way family stories do. They become part of the collective memory. For a long time, people avoided talking about it openly. Not because it was a secret, but because it felt wrong to speak too casually about something so awful. Over the years, though, it became something people mentioned when talking about how dangerous the mills used to be, or how much has changed, or how much hasn't. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea of a workplace memorial that isn't a plaque or a statue, but the actual machine where someone died. It's not abstract. It's not symbolic. It's real, solid, made of steel, the same steel that killed him. People who don't come from industrial towns sometimes have a hard time understanding how something like that could be accepted. Why not tear it down? Why not remove it completely? But for the people here, tearing it down would feel like erasing him. Leaving it there is a way of acknowledging what happened, of refusing to forget. When you hear the story as a kid growing up here, it hits you differently. It's not like a ghost story meant to scare you for fun. It's a warning, a reminder that the work that built the town came at a cost, that people died so others could live normal lives. That steel isn't just metal, it's history, sweat, and sometimes blood. Even now, long after the steel industry stopped being the center of everything, the story still lingers. The mills may be quieter, some of them abandoned or repurposed, but the past doesn't disappear just because the machines stop running. It stays in stories like this, in places like that vat. There are people who swear they feel something when they walk past it. Not anything supernatural, just a heaviness, a sense that something terrible happened there. Whether that's imagination or empathy doesn't really matter. The feeling is real to them. What stays with me most about the story isn't just the horror of the death itself, but how final it was. There was no recovery, no funeral in the traditional sense, no body to bury. His resting place became the thing that killed him. That's a kind of ending that feels deeply unfair, even by the harsh standards of industrial work. It also forces you to think about how many similar stories there might be that never became memorials. How many people were injured or killed in ways that didn't leave behind a physical reminder. How many names were lost to time because there was nothing solid left to mark what happened. This one stayed because it couldn't be removed. Whenever people talk about workplace safety now, about procedures and safeguards and regulations, stories like this are the unspoken reason why those things exist. They aren't just rules written on paper. They're responses to real deaths, real mistakes, real people who never went home. In a strange way, that vat serves as a reminder every single day, not just of one man, but of an entire era. Of a time when steel ruled everything and demanded everything in return. Of how progress was paid for in ways that don't always show up in history books. Even if you don't believe that his remains are still physically there, the idea that they might be is enough to make you pause. enough to make you lower your voice, enough to make you feel a quiet respect for the place and the people who work there. It's not a story people tell to scare outsiders. It's something locals carry with them, whether they work in the industry or not. It's part of the town's identity, like an unspoken scar. And every time someone mentions that vat, every time the story gets retold, that man is remembered. Not as a statistic, not as an accident report, but as a person who went to work one day and never came back, whose life ended in a way so extreme that it fused him forever into the history of the place he helped build. That's why the vat remains. Not because it's useful, but because forgetting would feel worse. I used to live in Athens, and like a lot of people who spend time there, I had routines that felt so familiar they became invisible. Running was one of mine. I ran at night, not because it was especially smart or dramatic, but because that was when my head finally quieted down. The streets felt different after dark, less busy, less watched. Just me, my breathing, the rhythm of my feet on pavement, and the predictable landmarks I passed every single time. One of those landmarks was on Milledgeville Avenue. Most people I knew didn't even call it by its real name. We called it Sorority Lane. Anyone who lived there knew exactly what you meant the second you said it. It wasn't just a road, it was a stretch of memory lined with big houses, old trees, and that unmistakable sign. The sign was tall and strange in a way that made it stick in your mind. Two legs, almost like stilts, holding it up. It wasn't decorative or artistic. It was functional, awkward, and impossible to miss. It stood there quietly, night after night, while cars rushed past it and runners like me slipped by beneath it without thinking twice. I passed that sign every night I ran. Not sometimes, not occasionally, every single time. It marked a point in my route where I knew how far I had gone and how far I still had to go. If I made it there, I was committed. There was no turning back early once I passed that spot. It was a mental checkpoint more than anything else. That night felt normal. I remember the air, though. Not in a dramatic way, but in the way your body registers something without making a note of it. It was one of those nights where the world felt settled. No tension, no sense of urgency, just another run. I passed the sign, like always, my feet hitting the pavement in that steady cadence that makes you feel invincible in a quiet, temporary way. Nothing was wrong. I finished my run, got home, cooled down, did whatever small, forgettable things make up the rest of an ordinary night. At some point, time passed without me noticing. Maybe I checked my phone, maybe I showered, maybe I just sat there letting the tiredness settle into my legs. Then I heard about the crash. A car, driving under the influence, had slammed into that sign. The same one I ran past every night. The impact was so severe that the car became stuck. Not just damaged, but trapped. Metal twisted around the legs of the sign. The vehicle caught fire. Some of the passengers died. The part that makes my chest tighten even now is the timing. It happened maybe 30 to 45 minutes after I passed that spot on my run. Not hours later, not the next morning, not some abstract earlier that night that lets you mentally distance yourself from it. Less than an hour. Close enough that the night was still the same night. Close enough that I could picture exactly where I was. Exactly what I was doing when everything went wrong. I can still see the sign in my mind the way it looked when I passed it. Quiet, empty, just standing there like it always did. An hour later, it was wrapped in fire and death. That realization crept in slowly, and when it did, it felt wrong in a way that's hard to describe. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It wasn't responsibility. It was this hollow, sinking awareness of how thin the line had been. How casually I had crossed that space, unaware that it was about to become the center of something horrific. I started doing the math without meaning to. If I had run a little slower, if I had taken a longer route, if I had stopped to stretch, if I had tripped, if I had tied my shoe, any tiny change could have put me there at a different moment. And then the thought that really sticks its claws into you shows up. What if I had been there when it happened? Maybe I could have helped. Maybe I could have called for help faster. Maybe I could have done something, anything, even if it wouldn't have changed the outcome. Or maybe I would have been another person standing there helpless, watching a car burn while people inside it screamed or went silent. That's the part your mind doesn't like to settle on, because there's no version of it that feels good. I wasn't there, and because I wasn't there, I survived my night unchanged. I went to bed, I slept, I woke up, I continued living in a way that felt almost offensive. Once I realized what had happened so close to me in both time and space. When you hear about tragedies happening far away, your brain files them differently. You feel bad, maybe shaken, but there's distance. When it happens somewhere you were just standing, that distance collapses. The place becomes charged. You can't see it the same way again. After that, every time I ran that route, the sign looked different. It wasn't just a sign anymore. It was a marker of how easily things can tip from normal to catastrophic. I'd slow down without meaning to. My eyes would linger on it longer than before. Sometimes I'd picture the car wrapped around it, flames licking up into the night, sirens cutting through the darkness. The road itself felt different too. It's strange how a place can change without physically changing at all. The pavement was the same. The trees were the same. The houses were the same. But the knowledge sat on top of everything like a second layer, invisible but heavy. I thought about the people in that car more than I expected to. I didn't know them, I still don't. But I imagined their night before the crash, where they were coming from, whether they were laughing, whether they were arguing, whether they thought they were fine to drive, whether anyone hesitated even for a second before getting into that car. I thought about how sudden it must have been. One moment moving forward, the next violently stopped. Fire, confusion, panic, pain, the kind of chaos that doesn't feel real until it's already happening. And then I thought about how quiet it had been when I passed through. No warning, no sign, nothing to indicate that the space was about to become lethal. That's what messes with you the most. Not the event itself, but how invisible it was beforehand. How the world doesn't mark dangerous moments in advance. It just lets you walk or run or drive through them, completely unaware. For a while after that, I replayed the timing over and over in my head. Not because I thought I could change it, but because my brain seemed determined to understand it, as if understanding could somehow make it less disturbing. 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour maybe. Such a small window. I realized something uncomfortable during that time. The idea that maybe I could have helped is comforting and cruel at the same time. It gives you a sense of agency, but it also implies a responsibility you never actually had. The truth is, I don't know what I could have done. Fires like that move fast. Cars become death traps. Even trained responders sometimes can't reach people in time. But the human brain doesn't care about logic when it comes to near misses. It cares about proximity. It cares about almost there, almost involved, almost a witness, almost able to act. Those almosts stick with you, even now, years later. When I think about that night, what unsettles me isn't just the crash. It's the ordinariness of my own actions leading up to it. The fact that I passed that sign thinking about nothing more than my pace or my breathing or how far I had left to go. It reminds me how many moments like that exist in our lives. How many times we cross paths with places that are about to become scenes of tragedy. How often we walk away from something that will soon become someone else's worst day, without ever knowing it at the time. There's a strange survivor's dissonance in that. Not survivor's guilt in the traditional sense, but a quiet awareness that luck, timing, and randomness play a bigger role in our lives than we like to admit. That nothing about my safety that night was earned. It was accidental, circumstantial, a matter of minutes. I stopped running that route eventually, not immediately, not out of panic, just gradually. I found other paths, other streets, other landmarks to anchor my runs to. I told myself it was about variety, but I knew better. That sign had become too heavy. Passing it felt like brushing up against something unresolved. Even now, when I think about Athens, that image comes back. Not the college town energy, not the bars or the music or the football games. That sign, that stretch of road, that invisible line between before and after. I still think about the people who died that night, about the families who got phone calls that shattered their lives, about how their last moments happened on a road people used every day without fear, about how easily joy, recklessness, or bad judgment can turn fatal. And sometimes late at night, I think about the version of myself who passed that sign without a second thought. I don't blame that version of me. There was nothing to blame. But I wish I could go back and tell them how fragile that normalcy was, how close it came to breaking in a way that would have changed everything. That night taught me something I didn't ask to learn. That danger doesn't announce itself. That tragedy doesn't need a dramatic buildup. That sometimes the scariest thing is how close you can be to disaster without ever touching it. Just an hour, just a stretch of road, just a sign with two legs, and a reminder that life keeps moving, even when it's about to tear itself apart right behind you. It was a day that started with the promise of peace and ended with a violence that I still feel in my bones whenever I visit a riverbank. I was 19 years old at the time, an age where you think you are an adult but are really just a kid playing at being grown up. My girlfriend was 18 and she was pregnant with our first child. We were young, perhaps a bit overwhelmed by the future, but we were happy. We wanted to get away from the noise of the town, the questions from our families, and the stress of preparing for a baby. We decided to drive out to a secluded spot by the river, a place known for its high canyon walls and rushing water. It was supposed to be a romantic afternoon, a chance to sit in the sun, dip our feet in the water, and talk about names for the baby. We found a perfect spot on the sandy bank, spread out a blanket, and just enjoyed the sound of the nature around us. For the first hour, it was idyllic. The sun was warm, the water was cool, and we felt safe in our own little bubble. The silence was broken not by a sound of nature, but by a sound of pure human distress. It started as a low yelling, echoing off the canyon walls from across the river. At first, I thought it might be some kids messing around, maybe hikers shouting to hear their own echoes. But the yelling didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic, and more guttural. I sat up, shading my eyes against the sun, looking across the wide expanse of the river to the other side. The terrain over there was rugged, a steep mountain cliff that dropped sharply down to the water's edge. It wasn't a place where people usually hiked because the footing was treacherous. Then, I saw him. A man appeared at the top of the ridge across from us. He wasn't hiking, he was stumbling. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He was flailing his arms, screaming at something only he could see. Before I could even process what was happening, he lost his footing. He didn't just slide, he tumbled. It was a horrific sight to witness. He fell down the side of the mountain cliff, his body hitting rocks and bushes with sickening thuds. He rolled and bounced for what must have been 50 feet before he hit the flat ground near the riverbank with a heavy impact. I gasped, grabbing my girlfriend's hand. I was sure we had just watched a man die. I was already reaching for my phone to call for help, thinking he must have broken every bone in his body, But then the impossible happened. The man stood up. He didn't groan or hold his back in pain. He just sprang to his feet as if gravity didn't apply to him. He shook himself off and immediately started screaming again. It wasn't a scream of pain, it was a scream of pure, unadulterated madness. He locked eyes with us. Even from across the river, I could feel the intensity of his gaze. He started walking toward the water. He didn't look for a bridge or a shallow crossing. He just marched into the current. The river wasn't incredibly deep there, maybe waist high, but the current was strong. He fought against the water, his movements jerky and unnatural. As he got closer, the situation went from concerning to terrifying. He wasn't just walking, he was hurting himself. Every time he passed a large river rock that jutted out of the water, he would intentionally slam his head against it. He would rear back and headbutt the stone with sickening force over and over again. I could hear the wet thud of his skull hitting the rock even over the sound of the rushing water. Blood began to pour down his face, mixing with the river water, but he didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. It was clear, even to my naive 19-year-old brain, that this man was completely out of his mind on something. He was operating on a level of psychosis that detached him from physical pain entirely. My girlfriend was terrified. She moved behind me, clutching the back of my shirt. I stood up, trying to look bigger than I was, trying to be the protector, but inside, I was freezing up. The man finally reached our side of the river. He pulled himself up onto the sandy bank, dripping wet, blood streaming from his forehead and nose. He was a big guy, around 6 feet tall and probably 180 pounds of solid muscle. I, on the other hand, was 5'6" and weighed about 125 pounds soaking wet. I was a kid. He was a monster. He stumbled toward us, his eyes wide and unblinking, the pupils so dilated they looked like black holes. He was muttering and screaming intermittently. In that moment, my instinct wasn't to fight. It was to help. I made the stupidest mistake of my life. I thought maybe he was dehydrated, maybe he was in shock from the fall. I held out my water bottle toward him. I tried to speak calmly, telling him to take a drink, to sit down. I offered him the water like a peace offering, hoping to de-escalate whatever was happening. He stopped in front of me, towering over me. He looked at the water bottle, then at me. He snatched the bottle from my hand with aggressive speed. He opened it, took a small, frantic drink, and then, without a word, he threw the bottle into the river. He didn't just toss it, he hurled it with violence. Then he looked back at me. The switch in his brain flipped. He lunged. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't try to tackle me. He grabbed me. He wrapped his massive arms around my torso in a bear hug. But this wasn't an embrace. It was a vice. He squeezed. He squeezed with a strength that felt inhuman. I felt the air leave my lungs instantly. My ribs creaked under the pressure. He pulled me off my feet, lifting me into the air, and then slammed me down onto the rocky ground, never loosening his grip. He was on top of me now, his heavy, wet body crushing the life out of me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't expand my chest to take in air. Panic, hot and bright, exploded in my brain. He leaned his face down next to mine. I could smell the metallic tang of blood, the river water, and the sour chemical reek of his sweat. He opened his mouth and screamed directly into my ear. It was the loudest sound I have ever heard. He screamed, "Help me!" He screamed it over and over again. "Help me! Help me!" The irony was horrifying. He was begging for help while simultaneously murdering me. He was crushing my spine, crushing my lungs, all while his broken mind screamed for salvation. My girlfriend was screaming somewhere in the background, a high-pitched sound of terror. I knew she couldn't help me. She was pregnant. She couldn't get involved in a physical fight with a maniac. I was on my own. My vision started to swim. Black spots danced at the edges of my sight. I knew with absolute certainty that if I didn't get out of this grip in the next 10 seconds, I was going to die. I was going to die right here on this riverbank, and then my pregnant girlfriend would be next. That thought, the thought of her and our unborn baby at the mercy of this lunatic, sparked a surge of adrenaline that I have never felt since. It was a fight-for-your-life reflex. I stopped trying to push him off because he was too heavy. Instead, I focused all my remaining energy on wiggling one arm free. He had pinned my arms to my sides, but the sweat and the water made us slippery. I squirmed and twisted, ignoring the pain in my ribs, and managed to pop my right arm loose from his embrace. I didn't think, I just reacted. I made a fist, winding back as far as I could in that cramped position, and I bashed him directly in the nose. I put everything I had into that punch. I felt the cartilage crunch under my knuckles. It was a brutal, ugly hit. The reaction was immediate. He recoiled, his head snapping back. He let go of me instantly, his hands flying up to his face. Blood gushed from his broken nose, blinding him. He rolled off me, screaming in a new kind of voice, a confused, garbled sound. He appeared to be completely blind at that point, whether from the pain, the blood in his eyes, or the drugs finally short-circuiting his vision. He began stumbling around in circles, swinging his arms wildly at the air, trying to find me. I didn't wait to see if he would recover. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air, my lungs burning as they finally expanded. I grabbed my girlfriend's hand. She was frozen in shock, tears streaming down her face. "Run!" I choked out. We ran. We ran up the sandy bank, scrambling over the rocks, tearing through the brush until we reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them once. I picked them up, jammed the key in the ignition, and we tore out of there. We didn't look back. We drove straight to the police station. It was miles away, and the drive felt like it took hours. I kept checking the rearview mirror, irrationally expecting to see him running behind the car, bloody and screaming. When we burst into the station, we were a mess. I was covered in dirt and river water, holding my ribs. My girlfriend was sobbing. We told the officers everything. We told them about the man, the cliff, the self-harm, and the attack. We told them he was dangerous and that he was still down there. The police dispatched units immediately. We stayed at the station, giving statements, trying to calm down. Hours later, an officer came back to talk to us. The look on his face was grim. He told us that by the time they got there, the man was dead. After we had escaped, the man had continued his rampage against himself. He had stumbled away from the riverbank and found another cliffside nearby. Witnesses who had arrived later said he threw himself off the edge. And he didn't just do it once. He survived the first fall, climbed back up, and did it again. He repeated this until his body simply couldn't take any more. The toxicology report later revealed what had turned a human being into a zombie. He was on a cocktail of PCP and psilocybin mushrooms. The mushrooms had likely caused the terrifying hallucinations that made him think he needed help, that made him scream at invisible demons. The PCP provided the anesthesia and the superhuman strength that allowed him to fall down a mountain and get back up, and to crush me with such ease. It was a fatal combination of fear and power. That day remains the scariest day of my life. It changed me. It stripped away that feeling of invincibility you have when you are a teenager. I realized how fragile life is. I realized that you can be doing everything right. Trying to relax, trying to be kind, trying to share your water. And violence can still find you. I still have nightmares about the weight of him on top of me, the smell of his breath, and that haunting scream of "help me" ringing in my ear. It is a reminder that there are demons in this world, some created by chemicals, and when you meet them, there is no reasoning with them. You can only fight, run, and hope you survive. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments. And in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.